All right, how's everybody doing? Can you hear me okay? Audio good? Good. So we've got a mixed group, and these SDGs fantasy until it comes with the standard. And these SDGs fantasy until education comes with the standard. All right. I'm not sure I totally understand that, but yes, we're gonna talk about the SDGs. So I've talked about this somewhat before, but I'm gonna go into a little more higher level of detail on this. Just because, so we've got a mixed group. We got a bunch of people who are in biosphere and global biosphere, former students, and we've got new folks looking at environmental accounting. So, and all of that stuff, in management, kind of communication in the global biosphere, and environmental accounting all kind of link into the SDGs very closely. Hence, I thought this is a really good subject to talk about. And I work on it. So that's the motivation. So there's two main motivations that I wanted to do to focus on this. For one, is relevant to the things that some people are working on in their courses. However, I hear SDGs all the time. Like, you go to conferences, I hear it out in the world, and a lot of the times the folks that are talking a lot about it, wearing the little pin and so forth, I start to ask them some more detailed questions about it, and they don't know the answer. Like, they actually don't really know what's going on. So what they know about the idea of it. And so I want to kind of just kind of get down to the meat and potatoes of it first for you, and then kind of just give my experience working on them with different countries, and to kind of test this question I have, which is this a reality or is this just a fantasy, right? And then I will give you my opinion at the end, which is my opinion. But first, we need to kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of what they are, okay? Everybody familiar with the SDGs? Yeah or no? Heard of them before? I assume yes for the most part, but if you haven't, we'll start from ground zero. So they are the Sustainable Development Goals. And like everything, I'm going to send in links as we go through. Now, I'm up the game a bit for this kind of broadcast. And of course, I'm recording it. I'm trying to get quicker to post it to YouTube. So all of them are up on YouTube up until this episode, I guess. So if you want to look at previous versions, they're up on the YouTube channel. In addition, I have got all the notes for each session are compiled, and they're available for download as a PDF via a link in the description of each of the YouTube videos. That's the best way for me to get it to you. And within those notes are some speaking notes and just things that I've noted, but then also some links, because when you see the YouTube recording, the discussion's not kind of recorded or shared. So you can see all the links that I share with you in that document, as well as some additional notes, which might be helpful, particularly for the charting your path one that I did. All right, so SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. This is the website that you need to start with right off the bat if you're looking at these. Just one sec here. This is that website there. If you go there, that's going to show you kind of what the big picture is about the SDGs, and then also a bunch of additional information. So if you look at that, I'm just going to go there as well. You'll see, first thing, you see that wheel with all the different colors and so forth. Okay, so if you're going to meetings or you watch the television, like next time you watch the news, keep your eye open for that. There's a pin that a lot of people will wear that has that circle with all of those colors on it. It's the emblem or the logo for the SDGs. So you really can pick out people that are like, I don't know, maybe a little more progressive in their thinking or so forth right away. As soon as you see that pin, it's like, okay. So I would never expect really to see that pin on Ford. I'd be really surprised. Or Jason Kenney, I'd be pretty surprised. Or Andrew Scheer, I would never expect to see him wearing that pin. No, it is. Like, I would be surprised if I saw it there, just because it symbolizes, and in fact, like, they may very well believe in a lot of these things that are kind of the goals that we're trying to achieve with the SDGs. However, what it symbolizes is, it symbolizes kind of this global approach to human well-being and environmental well-being, which is, that doesn't go along with the narrative of some of these politicians, even though they actually, do have policies that kind of move things direction. Brian Mulroney, for instance, is a conservative former prime minister who was it'd be hard not to say that he's the greenest prime minister in Canadian history, recent Canadian history, because of his track record. Whereas, he doesn't wear the pin on his lapel per se. Anyway, look around for it. I see it all the time. I'm like, okay, I know where you're coming from if they're wearing that pin. Much as someone has an Order of Canada pin, that they're coming from a certain kind of gang. So if you look at that website, you'll see that the breakdown of the different topics, and then kind of there's a lot of information on this website, which is useful. It's the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal Knowledge Platform. Okay, so it was an agenda for sustainable development. That's what the Sustainable Development Goals are, to be achieved by 2030. So that's the timeline. We're in 2020, so there's 10 more years basically until we're trying to hit the goals that they're laid out in the SDGs. It's adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015. And basically, it's a kind of a blueprint and work for peace and prosperity for people on the planet now and into the future. And there are 17 specific goals, sustainable development goals, which call for action by the countries, both in the developing world and the developed world, to move towards ending poverty and other major issues, such as someone asked me if the environment SDG asked me if I thought the SDGs are environment-based. They're all. I'm going to get to this, which is a good point. The SDGs encompass all of those factors. Okay, so I'll get to your question as I explain, because the next question is, where did this come from? Where did this evolve from? And it really started initially, I would say, in formulation in 1992. So in 1992, in the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, that's when Agenda 21 was formulated, which was kind of one of the first global frameworks for sustainable development. Agenda 21 was coining the term sustainable development, which was a comprehensive plan to build a global partnership for sustainable development and to move forward for sustainable human and environmental development. So in fast forwarding then to 2000, in the year 2000, UN member states unanimously adopted the Millennium Declaration at the Millennium Summit in year 2000 at UN at the headquarters in New York City. And what happened there was, and this speaks to your question, Mona, was the development and endorsement of 8 Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals were designed primarily to reduce extreme poverty by the year 2015. So those are more, the MDGs, which are the precursor to the SDGs, were focused more on human development issues such as infant mortality, poverty alleviation, education, those kind of human development objectives, which are pretty common to that group. And environment was on the side a bit. It wasn't really as playing as critical a role as it does now in the SDGs. So in Rio Plus 20, so in 12 years after that, and 20 years after the initial Rio Summit, so Rio Plus 20 was the 20th anniversary of the 1992 Earth Summit, where Agenda 21 was established. The member states, again, the UN member states adopted a document called The Future We Want, where they decided to launch a process to develop a set of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, building upon the MDGs. So the MDGs were shooting for 2015. That was the horizon for them when they wanted to be achieved. And after that, it's like, well, what are we going to do next? Well, the idea there, and this is in 2012, and in fact, I was there at that conference, they launched this new kind of movement amongst different UN member states to come up with a new set of kind of a new agenda. So the Rio Plus 20 outcome had other measures implementing sustainable development because it was well recognized at the Rio Plus 20 that the environment was falling behind. And the MDGs actually, for the most part, were a fairly resounding success. So a lot of progress was made on poverty alleviation and so forth under the context of the Millennium Development Goals, and most people consider the MDGs as a policy success. So they wanted to build on that by looking at the critical role of environmental sustainability and rolling that into this whole process. And you got to understand, it's like there's the policy frameworks that are agreed upon globally, and then each country has to agree to work towards that, and then there needs to be mechanisms and financing put in place to help everybody move towards that. Not Canada per se, but say developing countries usually are the ones that require financing to give them support for moving forward on these fronts. So in January 2015, the General Assembly began to develop this post-2015 development agenda, which was ultimately resulted in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and that is what we refer to now as the SDGs. And the core of it is the 17 specific Sustainable Development Goals, which is which are broken down. I'm going to show you them in detail, which are outline what are the objectives and with specific targets and indicators. So at that same year in 2015, there was a lot of things that happened in that year in the international kind of policy community, one of which was the Sendai Framework. So we discussed Sendai Framework last week, was adopted for disaster risk reduction. You had the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development. You had the 2030 Goal for Sustainable Development, the SDGs were adopted, and you also had the Paris Agreement for Climate Change adopted in December of 2015. So lots of things happened at that point in time. So how does this all work? With any kind of like international framework, you need an organizing body, and you need kind of political forums that will help to support the meetings. So for the SDGs, you have the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, which is the central UN platform for the follow-up and the review of the SDGs. And you have the Division for Sustainable Development, which is basically a part of the UN, which is responsible for kind of gathering the data, integrating the data, communicating with the different agencies in the different countries, and moving this agenda forward. Okay, so that is kind of the organizational body. There's the Division for Sustainable Development Goals. They call it the DSDG, and they are housed within the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA. And they help out with providing capacity development, capacity building, support for the different areas and so forth, because there's a lot of different aspects to the SDGs. And you'll find that if you get into this stuff further, you can work on water quality alone, still be working on the SDGs. You could be working on climate change and still be working on the SDGs. So it connects with all of those different agendas. All right, so that's where this all came from. It didn't happen like last week. It's been a long time in coming, and these things typically are like that. So next link here is, what are they? What are these things? Boom. If you go to that link there, this will show you what are the different SDGs. Okay, so if you look at these, there's 17. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and partnerships for the goals. Okay, so now the first, I would say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Those ones are, I don't know, your bread and butter MDG type of thing. I mean, education, zero hunger, no poverty, gender equality. Those kind of are the standard development goals that we've understood. And then if you, the additional ones, so like sustainable clean energy, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, attention to inequality, climate action, life below water. So the environment ones, 13, 14, 15, those ones I hit all the time with our work because it's, we are working a lot on the environment related stuff. So 13, 14, 15 are that's a lot of our kind of type of stuff. So you see that, like, I mean, there's a pretty broad swath of what one has to deal with when you're trying to report on these things. So if you look in each one of those, if you were to click, say, on one, Sustainable Development Goal 1, and poverty in all its forms everywhere, the articulation of what that's all about. And in those tabs there, you can see there's progress. This is great because they have an anecdotal description of how things have progressed on that goal in, say, 2019, 2018, 2017, 2016, etc. But they also have here in the far right there, if you click on that, targets and indicators. And this is a really important part of this website, and one that I'd focus you on for all of you. It really outlines what you actually measure. So you look at this, you have the targets on the left. So target 1.1 is by 2030, and most of these are by 2030. Eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living less than $1.25 a day. Okay, that's the target. And then the indicator is usually the things that you measure in country. So, and these numbers are important because this is what you refer to all the time when you're working on this stuff. And the indicator is 1.1.1, proportion of population below the international poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographical location, say urban versus rural. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you go through all of these SDGs, so if I were to go back and let's go to one that we would work on a lot, which is 13. So if you click on Sustainable Development Goal 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, you'll see the progress across the years, and then you look at the indicators. Okay, so you can see here, strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries. So like this one here is 13.1.1, number of deaths, missing persons, and persons affected by disaster per 100,000 people. So that's something that's measurable. And if you fast forward down there, you can see there's things related to, let's see, number of countries, 13.3.1, number of countries that have integrated mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warning into primary, secondary, and tertiary curricula. Okay. So if you look at all those things, you can see, what is expected. And this is a bit of an interesting one, though. If you look at that, if you look in detail at these ones, as well as the other ones for the other, like say, life on land or what have you, you'll find some things will pop up as questions, I guess you could say. Okay, this is something I want to talk about. All right, so those are the kind of the breakdown of them. 17 included, in which there's a bunch of sub-targets and then sub-indicators in each one. And you can then see how they measure progress. And measurement is largely can be anecdotal. However, in those targets, those specific indicators that they have with each target, you can measure each one of those things, which is important. Okay. And so Obviously, when you look at this at the global level with this website here, you can see that there's a heck of a lot of integration. A lot of work needs to go with working with all the different nation states to get the data, to have them report properly and just put this stuff together. So there's a lot of work that's ongoing on this. Okay. So that's kind of how it all works together as a kind of so if someone asks you which direction is the planet going in right now, one thing you could say is, well, I don't know. I mean, why don't you go look at the Sustainable Development Goals sites and look at the progress on the SDGs, and you can choose one of those SDGs. Like if you're concerned about, say, poverty, go to that one and look at the progress on the target on the SDG one over the last 3 years, right? Boom, that really gives someone kind of a direction to go in, and they'll get pretty good analysis because this is all it goes across the world, right? But how does this occur at the national level? So I personally and my team, we work, yes, at the global level, but we also work at the national level. So each member that is a part of this, they have an obligation to gather the data for those different indicators. So take a look at this there, and you will see who these member states are. Okay, so this is important as well. So if you happen to be working on this stuff and you get a job in a specific country on, say, climate adaptation, you want to go here as one of your first stops, right? You want to go, if it's climate, you want to go to UNFCCC, but you want to go here as well to see where they're at with their reporting on the SDGs. Okay, so if you look at this, you can see on the left the review year and the state, right? So like Armenia, there's 2020 and 2018. Argentina 2020, 2017, and if you scroll down a bit, you can see Canada's, which was done in 2018. So it's 2 years ago that Canada submitted their update. So you can click on each one of those member states, and you can get a full kind of snapshot of their review of their voluntary. So the report is called a voluntary national review. So that is the report that the country submits on a periodic basis, which outlines their progress on all of the SDGs, the targets, and the indicators. And it should give the reader then specific measurements as to how they've addressed certain things like poverty alleviation or whatever. Okay, so you can go and really get a good feel for the country right away by looking at the high-level panel form VNR National Review, this first tab here, and then you can dig into it. So they might have like a series of specific national reports. So if you go to Documents and Reports for, say, Canada, where I'm at right now, so I'll put this one through here. You go take a look at that, Member States Canada, and then go to Documents and Reports. There's a ton of different sub-reports there on, say, the energy industry. See, if you click on energy and sustainable development, Canada, energy in the context of sustainable development. And this report gives you a kind of an overview of how Canada is dealing with the energy problem in the context of what we're trying to achieve with sustainable development. The Canadian Framework for Sustainable Development of Energy, evolution of, you can go right through this, which is quite informative, actually. So it's good that we have this kind of level of detail in place, right? And so they outline all the programs and so forth and so on. So it's a great resource, really, if you want to get up to speed and on where a country is at right away on a specific subject or specific one part of the SDGs. Okay? So their VNR, now, in order to see where they're at, though, you want to look at their VNR, the actual document, not the review. Okay? So here is, this link here is going to take you to, boom, that's Canada's. So if you go to that website there, you're going to see a PDF document, which is Canada's implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, Voluntary National Review 2018. And this PDF is, I don't know how many pages long. It's, I don't know, probably about 60 or so. If I look at the, I don't know, table of contents, it'll tell you. But it gives you an outline and like qualitative description up front of how they're progressing on certain themes. But then if you look at if you scroll down, it will go through each one of the Sustainable Development Goals. Like on page 17, of the PDF, if you go to that page, you'll see goal by goal actions. This is the part I like, so I have to get right to it most of the time because I'm busy. SDG 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. No poverty, that's the goal. Blah, 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 talks about all this stuff, and then you can see some of the data that we're gathering. So this is coming from StatsCan, Canadian Income Survey, which is the low income rate for Canada. So that shows you how that the low income for most at risk of poverty. So it's another type of certain statistic they're using. So in Canada, it would be StatsCan would be responsible for putting a lot of this data. A lot of it would come from different surveys or the census, and then they would call upon different groups to submit or to contribute to this, right? So if you go through this, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but it's pretty informative. You know, if you go through this, the whole poverty section in Canada is done. There's a lot of special attention paid to vulnerable groups, First Nations and so forth, as well as people with disabilities and so forth. That gives a really good snapshot of a country. So if you go to SDG 2, end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition to promote sustainable agriculture, you can go through this again. It gives you some sort of description, got specific indicators, right? So if you go to page 28, right here we got SDG indicator 2.1.2 PR.A, food insecurity, moderate number of persons in households 12 years and over. Okay, so that gives you an actual detailed number of food insecurity. Okay, and so there may be some adaptation of these indicators per country, but in all cases they should explain why they've included it, how they've treated the data, and in this case here you can see the source of the data for this one, for the Inuit indicator. This one is proportion of Inuit adults 25 years and over who lived in a household with food insecurity in the past 12 months. Okay, and then they've got the source there. So again, a really great indicator, and it gives them an indication of rising to the challenge, what they're doing in order to address this kind of food security, which is, you know, happens across different sectors and demographics. Okay, so that's just Canada, and that same report can be accessible for any country, right? So, and you'll see actually, typically, often you'll see that the reports for other conventions or initiatives are not as kind of, there's a lot of discrepancy between the reports for, say, I don't know, Canada versus Nicaragua or you know, Honduras or Gambia or, you know, Mali. But I have found that for the SDGs, they're actually pretty consistently pretty good. The VNRs are quite good across the board. And the reason for that is that there's quite a bit of support and capacity development funding that goes to nation states that need it. So Canada is a good example of a fully resourced country that's doing this work. We've got a lot of like good, you know, well-paid, qualified, educated people doing that report and contributing to it, and it shows it's well done. However, there's also several developing countries that are having to do this as well, right? And you can see that in the list. So who does the work? Usually the group, there's a group. Okay, Mona, it's interesting that Global Affairs was responsible for producing the report. I find it interesting that Global Affairs was responsible for producing the report. Why do you find that interesting? I mean, it's an interface to the UN. So I kind of do see why Global Affairs plays a big role in it. Now, I don't know. Now, this is a good point, and I can find out for you actually if you want, and I will find out because I'm curious about it. I believe that it wasn't just Global Affairs was doing a lot of the environment. Yeah, the Environment Canada will contribute to it for sure, but Environment Canada would be contributing for the 3 environmental SDGs for 13, 14, 15. Those are the ones they would be producing the data for and contributing for. But this SDGs is across the board, you know. So what about all the poverty data, right? Environment Canada won't have that. That's going to be with, I don't even know what they're called, social development or whatever the ministry is called right now. What about all the issues pertaining to innovation, right? Because that's one of the SDGs. Inequality. So StatsCan will have a lot of that data, right? And Environment Canada will contribute to it for sure, though. Like they are going to be a major contributor to climate change, SDGs, anything related to land conservation, et cetera, extinctions and so forth. So, but this leads into, I got you. Yeah, I mean, they would be, so the person that is submitting this is the is the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. They're the one who is the author of this report, and they would be the representative sitting at the UN high-level political forum where they discuss these. That person and their team will be the ones that will go to that conference and present this and discuss it and negotiate on behalf of Canada. These are good questions, because it's hard to understand how all this stuff works. And it's a totally different group. For climate change, UNFCCC, it's Environment Canada. They have a team, a focal point, which is like an individual and a group of people that go to the climate change meetings. They go to the biodiversity meetings. They negotiate. They prepare those reports. So for that stuff, yes. For purely environment-related things, that's their shtick. So who does the work? This is leading right into my kind of text. It's usually there's a group at the national level that's responsible for synthesizing the data and producing the report. Now, I'm not sure it's actually Global Affairs Canada. Global Affairs Canada probably is submitting it, but the production of the report, I'm not sure. I have to check on that. In my experience in other countries, and that's where most of my experience is it's the Department of Statistics is usually the one that produces the reports. There's a statistics department, and the reason for that is they're the ones that do the census. They have all the data that's broad across the development data as a whole. Therefore, they are the ones that usually are responsible for producing it. However, there is a lot of coordination that needs to occur in order to produce this report, right? Statistics, the Department of Statistics for St. Lucia, who we've worked with, they don't have environment people, they don't have climate change data, they don't have that. So they have to then coordinate with the different agencies. So there's a lot of different coordination that goes along with producing these things. It's a mix of quantitative and qualitative data, but however, what's great about this is there are several explicit indicators. So if you look at the targets, the SDGs, the targets and the indicators, they're quite descriptive. Like they are specific. Proportion of people living below the poverty line defined by this $1.25 a day US. That's clear and that's measurable, which is great, because we need that kind of level of specificity. For those that in environmental accounting, that's the kind of stuff that we need to work with, especially when we start to look at tying finance to that. So what are some challenges then with this process? And this is speaking from my experience. So data acquisition can be a very big challenge. So getting this data can be a challenge, because it needs to be timely and it needs to be specific to the indicators that are being asked for to be reported on. Another big challenge with this process is explaining the relevance to stakeholders can be challenging. So it can be, and this is at the national level primarily. So you're talking to different types of stakeholders, say in different ministries, like frontline ministries, say like I'm working in Guyana right now and Antigua. And when you have to make sure that you explain the relevance of this to, say, the Ministry of Agriculture, right? Or the Ministry of Social Development or whatever it is, because they need to know. It's like, well, here's another thing that we have to do. We have to gather data for. Having good baseline data to draw is also a challenge. Yes. So data quality and having the data and having good quality data. So you have to ensure, like this is a big issue we run into a lot. My team and I with our work is making sure people understand the necessity for quality data, because that quality is based on their work of gathering the data, like going out and doing surveys and so forth. So in Canada, we actually have very good resources to do this. So we have a lot of the data acquisition processes are quite well developed. StatsCan is a world leader. I mean, StatsCan goes and lectures other countries how to do this stuff. How in developing countries, they often do not have the resource in place for doing this kind of work. Okay, so one of the things I explained up front was the fact that the UN organization responsible sustainable development goals, kind of secretariat, if you will, a big part of their job is ensuring that different countries have the capacity in order to do this. So they call it capacity development. So I work on capacity development. I help train groups. We're doing mostly the environment side of this, the environment data acquisition and reporting. But there's across the board, they need to know how to gather the data, what kind of data to gather, and then the processes for implementing frameworks for gathering the data and reporting on this. Because, I mean, these goals are in place at the international level, but they also need to be in place at the national level. And then you need to monitor and evaluate how progress is being made. So data collection, these are the weaknesses that I find. Data collection, how do you collect data? What data do you collect? Data processing. So how do you process that data? What kind of statistical analysis do you need to do? And so forth. The analysis and interpretation of that data, and then reporting. How do you translate that data into the reports that are required? All those areas need support. So this is the stuff that I kind of work on. So we see this a lot, and therefore periodically, and how does this happen? Well, the UN puts out consultancies for people that know about this stuff to go and work for them to help these countries develop the capacity for doing this. That's how it works. Okay. So is this just a government thing, Michelle, and standardized data methods so that it's meaningful? Exactly. So there has to be standardized methods across the board. Otherwise, you get kind of inconsistencies in the data all over, from country to country to country. And so then you can't kind of aggregate this data together and say, like, how do we do this year on poverty alleviation? Well, you've seen inconsistent data across the board. So in some cases, on different conventions and so forth, like say for the environment, the UN provides global data, like say for, I don't know, land degradation or that kind of stuff. There's global data sets that are, of course, but in this case, it's so specific to the countries there, they need to gather the data and they need to follow standardized procedures for that. So that's an important part of it. So is this just a government thing? Well, no, it's not. There are several stakeholders involved. So stakeholder engagement, partnerships, and communication and outreach. I don't know if you can hear the rain in the background. It's starting to pour in Vancouver. So this is a big part of this, as engagement, partnerships, communication, and outreach. There's a whole part of the UN kind of secretariat is devoted towards this. It aims to support major groups such as NGOs, business, governments, international organizations, regional organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So multi-stakeholder partnerships and voluntary commitments are also a big part of this movement, and partnerships for achieving these SDGs. And all of those are outlined on that main website that I've given you. So if you can take a look at that and read into the kind of the partnerships part of it, just to see how different groups fall into play. So a lot of like the IUCN, for instance, or WRI or WWF, those kind of international NGO research groups, they work on SDG stuff all the time as well. So what are some of the challenges? Can be difficult to get stakeholders together to agree on a direction. There's different agendas involved, especially at the national level. What change management framework do they have experience with in terms of the implementation programs you've been involved in? But I think it should be adaptive co-management. Really don't know. Okay, good question. I'll get to that. I'm going to finish and then I'm going to answer that. Okay? That's a good question. I have to go in a different direction to answer that properly. So what are some challenges, different agendas? Private sector, what about that? Well, guess what? Private sector is responsible for a lot of the degradation environmentally, so they got to be involved. And this is a big problem across the board, not just with SDGs, but climate change, biodiversity, land degradation, et cetera, et cetera. But they are increasingly involved, which is good. You can see more and more of the private sector is getting involved. So one of the means of them getting involved with this specific movement of the SDGs is the UN Global Compact, okay? So here is that link, so that can take you to the UN Global Compact, and then this is their attention to how they outline the progress on the SDGs, or what their mission is, okay? So what's interesting is and you don't really see this as much with other, like with say the biodiversity, you definitely don't see this, but you see companies participating but not reporting. So at the company level, you are starting to see more and more different companies that are wanting to or willing to be part of the UN Global Compact, but also submit what is called COPs, Communications on Progress. So communications on how those organizations, companies, are advancing different parts of the SDGs, so like poverty alleviation or climate change or whatever. So I've chosen a couple of these, and you can see these here on this website here. These are the the groups that have signed on. So this is where you can submit a communications of progress, and these are a list of all of the groups that are actually active on this front. So if you go to those, it's interesting because then, like for those that are in environmental accounting, this is really important because you want to know what companies are linked into this, because they need to use environmental accounting in order to kind of fulfill the data requirements for these reports. It's part of the deal. Okay, so what you're going to be learning is really relevant to that. So if you go to the last website I sent, you can see this one. This is actually that's for one of them. That was for Hydro-Quebec. Okay, so okay, so the first one. Look at this one here first. Bang, that list there. That is the active organizations who are total number of GC active COPs received. Global Compact active, communications on progress received. So there's 45,897, right? So it's not like one or two companies. Like there's a lot of companies that are doing this, or at least bought into this. Now, if you look at these, if you go and choose a couple of these, so I chose Hydro-Quebec, because I got an office in Montreal and I figured it would do it. So this gives an indication of when they did it. So this is published in 2020, but it was for January 19 to December 2019. Differentiation. This COP qualifies for the Global Compact active level, self-assessment, the SDGs. They got like a list of the parameters and the SDGs that they are advancing on. So they have, like, say, for instance, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, achieve gender equality, empowerment of all women and girls. Actually, they've checked the ones, selected all that apply. So the ones that are checked, which of the following SDGs do the activities described address? Select all that apply. So for them, SDG 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. That's one of the things that applies to them. SDG 8, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, decent work for all. Inequality, SDG 12, 13, 15, and 16. 15 is related to terrestrial ecosystems. And then climate change, SDG 13. So you'll see that, I mean, different organizations, it's more the stuff that they work on, their business is more relevant to different SDGs. And we'll get into that in a lot of detail. But you can see that. And then if you actually go to their report, so that's just their kind of summary, then if you click on their report, you'll see that, and they use here their sustainability report as their file report, which that serves a broader purpose. It's not just about the SDGs, it's about their progress and sustainable development in general. So if you click on that, that's usually what an organization will use. This is their 2019 Sustainable Development Report, a sustainability report. And within that, you'll see how they report. And they probably will even, I haven't looked at this one in that level of detail, but usually what they'll do is in the indicators that relate to the SDGs, they'll actually cross-reference the SDG target number, SDG 1.1 or whatever it is within that, where they have it listed. Usually that's what they'll do. Okay, so you can see the clear connection between their sustainability activities and what's going on at the global level. Okay, so that's Hydro-Quebec, and then there's one other I want to show you here, which is Scotiabank. So Scotiabank, in that whole list, you can browse through that and see all of the different groups that are doing it. There's a lot of Canadian groups that are doing it, and another one is Scotiabank. So if you look at that link there and go to that, you'll see Scotiabank's. Now they don't call it their sustainability report. They call it their environment, social, and governance report, ESG. And, you know, we'll get into that in detail as well. And then if you look through that, you'll see all that they are gathering, social governance and so forth, climate commitments and so forth. And SDGs, so the Sustainable Development. If you look at that in the table of contents on page 4, you'll see they have a direct reference to the SDGs on page 12. So if you go to page 12 on that, you'll see that 9, 10, 11, 12. They have the SDGs that relate to them. 1, 3, 4, 5, 8, 13. Those are the SDGs that they're reporting on, within which they have each targets: 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 3.2, 3.4, 3.8. And, you know, it's not always all of them, right? Like, of all the targets and indicators that are used across the board, there may be a subset of them used for a specific organization, okay? And you get into this level of detail once you dig right into working on this stuff, okay? So this shows you that, I think, and why I wanted to get this to say, like, look, this isn't just like a government thing. Like, there's companies that are actively engaged with this, like to the point at which they're submitting reports to the UN. It's a company, like there's, you know, so it's real. So fantasy, and I'm going to get to Lance's question, but I want to conclude here. Okay, you saw Stantec, Golder, Associates, and Scotiabank. Yes, Stantec, yeah, I'm not surprised. Golder, I mean, they could do it. They do this stuff all the time. Stantec as well. Scotiabank. Look through that list, you'll see a lot. There's a lot of small groups in there too. Like, there's a lot of small little companies. Lance, I just came from a settlement country working with. Okay, well, my gosh. The federal government, okay, good. That's a whole lot there. We had finished uploading the management program to the federal website. Who submissions for approval, tax breaks. I was impressed. That said, tourism did not offer much in the way of support or guidance. Yes, they not. Okay, Thomas and Friends too for all the parents out there. Okay, all right. So I'm going to answer Lance's question after I conclude. Fantasy, reality. What do you think? What do you think I'm going to say? Think this is a joke, or is this real? Real. Real, real. Real, real. Anybody else? Come on. Someone give me a diverging opinion. Someone's got to say fake news. There we go. Thank you, Jenny. Fantasy, fake news. Okay. My conclusion is fraud. Calm down. My conclusion is that, and it is an industry, I'll tell you that. Hopefully both. Hopefully it's a fantastic reality in a way. I hope that there's kind of some idealism that goes along with it, but it needs to be real. Goals are great. Aspirational goals are really great, but also you got to measure the stuff. So I'd say hopefully both. And my experience tells me it is both. And sometimes it's BS, and sometimes it is actually like very real. So we have the framework, we have buy-in, and we have data being collected. That's real. But we have to be aware of resistance to change, and we have to generate interest in this. Like, if it's really to progress, there's got to be way more organizations bought into it. It's voluntary, it makes it idealism. Yeah, but when voluntarism turns into like the status quo, then you've made some real progress. I would say that the odds are on our side. The odds of kind of success are in the favor, are more on that side than they are as it's going to be a failure. So I think there's also a tremendous side in the new opportunities that will emerge. So new tech, new policy, no social movements, a lot of stuff comes out of this, right? There's some big challenges with data. That is a big area. And moving the yardstick forward in specific areas. There's specific areas that are pretty tricky, climate change being one. And then another big problem is coordination. Because as you can see, there's a lot of different moving parts here. There's climate change, there's poverty alleviation, there's gender. And so there's this whole thing in the UN right now, they call it the One UN approach, which is trying to get everybody working together. And actually some of the most difficult challenges in the UN are getting different agencies working together. So a One UN approach can be quite tricky. So I say, yes, it's real because there's some good data. There's reports are being submitted and it's kind of advancing, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I'm just impressed with the level at which it's happening right now. So it's part of the discussion. That's something it is. Like it's something that people are talking about. Even the thing that I like that causes me to be somewhat optimistic is that it's part of the discussion in the private sector. Right. So in the private sector, people talk about this stuff, whereas they didn't talk about the MDGs in the private sector, like very little. You hear the Millennium Development Goals in the private sector. It wasn't a big thing. SDGs, way more. So I went to release on Victoria a couple months called Leading by Example, Imitation SDGs. Interesting to see how practice actually implementing goals. Yeah, cool, good. We can afford that, but still a small move can make a huge change. Exactly. From the list of reports submitted, there are only 3 companies that submitted. Whereas Singapore, 7 companies that submitted. Are you saying 3 companies from where? Canada. Yeah, well, I mean, hate to say it, but Canada talks a big game. We talk a big game, but man, we don't, for the most part, we don't deliver, right? So, like, it's easy to talk. It's a lot harder to do. So we have got to, yeah, it costs money and effort to do these reports. That's the other thing. You need to have, like, just so happens Scotiabank, that's not a small company, right? You need some resources. I think about this reporting that when the data is not good, governments are allowed to share their evaluation with the public. If the data is not good, then don't share. You need good data. Don't share if the data is not good. Then you need to work on that. So, I mean, in my experience, if we don't have good data, say for Guyana or whatever, we cite that. We say you need to have better data. What's the incentive to produce these reports when it's only voluntary? For who? For which group? For companies, you mean? Mona? Yes. What's the incentive? Well, what's the incentive doing a sustainability report, right? It's not mandatory half the time, but in some cases we'll see as we go forward, it helps a lot with risk management. So the carrying example is all about risk management. There's part of it that's optics, there's part of it that's PR, part of it's just creating a perception of like your company is actually advancing on this front. Why does RBC invest in water stuff so much? Right, that's RBC's Royal Bank's big thing for sustainability is water. I mean, that's just what they've chosen, you know, that's they've chosen that as their mission, right? And environment. So, and they invest a lot in that. So it's part of their kind of mission from a company standpoint. Okay, so I don't mean the data is bad. I mean the results weren't favorable for them with regard to climate adaptation. And if an adaptation action doesn't yet show, how do we commit to the council and to the public? Okay. If you're not making progress, then you say we're not making progress. Like, that's important. If you've got good data and it's just not advancing, I think you have to be honest about that, right? Like mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, it is challenging for local governments as well, but I honestly think it's their responsibility to share that and to be honest with that. Like if they're not making progress in greenhouse gas emissions reductions, you need to share that. Michelle, but RBC is connected to pipelines. Yeah, I mean, of course. Show me a bank. There's only a few banks that I can say, okay, good job, right? BNP Paribas is one of those banks. Okay, they're good job. Why? Because they'll give favorable rates to companies they're financing, energy companies that are diversifying their energy mix. They're fold. Like they really advance the cause. They were divesting from dirty energy. BNP Paribas. Yes. Well, we can talk further about that. So I want to get back to Lance's question, which was a good point. Because I have to give a presentation on that on Friday, I'm gonna talk about that, not to you guys, but to the UN. I'm going to go back here. What change management framework do you have experience with in terms of the implementation programs you've been involved in? I think it should be adaptive co-management, but really don't know. Yes. Okay. So I'm currently doing this for the government of for the UN, for the government of Guyana, I've developed a monitoring and evaluation program for framework for their Green State Development Strategy, part of which is linked to the SDGs. So their Green State, their national development plan program that aligns with the SDGs. We actually literally have the SDGs that each one of their national objectives are tied to. So what is the management framework that I chose to use for that, right? Because it's a management to implement that and monitor it. So M&E, monitoring and evaluation, is a process by which you assess how well you're doing. So back to Jenny's comment, is if you have an M&E program in place, that's going to tell you how well you're doing. And so I developed an M&E program for them, like as a project for the UN Environment Program for the GSDS for Guyana. And I chose to use a mix of adaptive management and adaptive governance. And so what's different than, and I haven't seen that before actually, so this is kind of cool, I guess, and they're excited about it, is now I chose that because we're in a state at which there's a lot of dynamic change in the actual things we're trying to monitor. So climate adaptation, for instance, is a good example, especially in Guyana, because if you've been there, it's a low-lying coastal country with a lot of exposure to sea level rise and storm surges and stuff like that. So, like we can't just implement this and leave it alone and everything's going to be good for the next 10 years. We need to revisit the indicators in our monitoring of it. So I chose to use that, and I drew in the literature from adaptive management, which isn't new. Adaptive management's been around for a while, and most of you know about that stuff. But I also chose to draw from the literature around adaptive governance, which is a little different because it's dealing with more institutional relationships and governance, like legislation and so forth, and how that can be enacted. Because typically governance is static. It's like you put in legislation and it's like there. But the reality is we're moving into this kind of like this era in which there's a lot of dynamic change going on. We have to have some degree of kind of the capability to change in how we govern. So I drew on that, and I'm happy to share some of that literature around adaptive governance because I'm working on that right now. And I developed a framework which I think I can share. I'll see if I can share it. I'll see if I can. I'm under contract, so I don't know if I can share it yet, but I will share it if I can. And that is an M&E framework for them, which has these feedback loops. So that's a big part of it, is like having the capability to feedback at different stages of it and different parts of the framework. So I chose to have two nested, one overall feedback loop, which allows them to look at, for one, how well the data is being gathered. So kind of look at some quality assurance for data acquisition. And then I put another feedback loop for the actual indicators to look at how well those indicators are actually effectively monitoring or benchmarking. Do they work? And I did an overall. Well, I chose I'm choosing a qualitative, a survey. It's an assessment based on the frontline M&E officers. They're to be asked on a periodic basis whether or not that indicator is effectively capturing what's going on with that issue. So I've got I don't know off the top of my head, I have like 5 different parameters for the actual M&E indicators. And then I have one giant feedback loop for the system itself to sit down with the secretariat. So there's a secretariat for that program, like for the GSDS, that are responsible for implementation. So all of the agencies, like the reporting agencies, agriculture, energy, so forth and so on, they report to the secretariat. And there needs to be some sort of feedback mechanism where they evaluate periodically at a cabinet level how well it's working. So there's the system look, and then there's actual looking at different components to see how well individual things are working. So this draws a lot on kind of like systems theory and so forth. Does the standard you're implementing with require indicators for all F17 SDGs? Well, what's interesting is it's for the GSDS. So they're not all of the SDGs. I haven't looked for sure, but I can't say for sure off the top of my head that all of the SDGs are directly correlated to the GSDS. However, they do have a group within the country that is responsible for producing the VNR for the SDGs. So they have a group that works on just the SDGs, whereas the GSDS, which is the Green State Development Strategy for Guyana, which is what I've been working on, that is really related to Guyana's situation. And in the case with Guyana, it's pretty interesting because, yeah, I'm sorry, I live in the world of acronyms, but the GSDS, what's interesting about it is like this context is very unique because they're like one of the lesser developed countries in South America that just struck a heck of a lot of oil offshore. Like their GDP is going to go up huge as a result of that. So that their GSDS, their Green State Development Strategy, has to like take that into consideration. So they don't, like, for instance, they don't just cruise forth and start to suffer from Dutch disease because they're just making all this money. And you know what I mean? Like you got to really kind of look at sustainable finance as well, and that they're not getting this kind of diluted perspective on how their country is developing just based on this one huge oil find. Dutch disease. Dutch disease is reliance on one commodity, more or less. I think it developed Dutch disease. It's called Dutch disease because the Dutch roses. Is that unique to Guyana? No, Dutch disease is, well, it's happened in, I mean, it happened in the Netherlands, you know, and it happened with Dutch disease. I believe it's with roses. Like they had a lot of roses, and roses at that time were highly valuable, and it kind of distorted their economy because they relied on a commodity that pumped everything up. Yeah, you can ask them about the tulips. That's it. It's tulips. And read up on Dutch disease. It's well known in economic literature how that one commodity, rubber is a good example too. When you have the rubber boom, they had the tulip boom. But once that commodity, like what if you get the market dives for that, then your whole economy dives. So you got to be very careful with that when you get like one commodity in your economy that like just gives you a jolt. And so there we go. Tourism to some degree, yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I chose, back to Lance's question, kind of a mix of adaptive management and adaptive governance in this. And I can, when I get the clearance, I'll share it. I should probably write an article on it or something like that. You have to get approval. I mean, it's all kind of weird with, you know, UN and stuff. Brunei, okay, good to know. Didn't know about that. So I heard the Dutch people are sending tulips to old folks home in Eastern Canada. Oh yeah, heard about that. That's great. So that's it. So this is what the SDGs are about. Okay. So is this kind of the panacea? No. I mean, it's a pretty effective framework for helping us look at how the world's doing, which is that's a big feat. Getting everybody to agree and then kind of agree to the same standards and reporting. That's a huge progress. But you know, there's a lot of challenges at the nation level and municipal level as well in order to like make sure things are advancing equally across the board. Even within Canada, you could say, you know, we've got challenges with respect to inequality in certain communities and parts of our country, which are certainly suffering, right? First Nations communities and so forth. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we have a working framework. I just don't. My only comment with this is like I don't say the SDGs and wear a pin and say that like, okay, well, this is the best thing since sliced bread. You know, there's a lot of work that happens at the ground level that we need to be aware of, whether we're dealing with the accounting part of things, we're looking at the excuse me, we're looking at the monitoring and evaluation, the indicators and so forth. And that is where the truth is. The truth lies in the data. How are they funded? Who? This sounds very interesting. A new concept does. Yeah, it's if you Google GSDS, if you find a whole website on it, I can actually send the link to it. How is the UN funded? The UN is funded through multilateral funding. So member states provide financing to the UN. So usually developed countries give money as a requirement to the UN, and that money then is divided up. They call it multilateral or bilateral financing, depending on how it's structured, but usually multilateral funding. So when you hear like Justin talk about we're going to take a multilateral approach to this or multilateral funds, it means that Canada or whomever else has given money to this part of the UN to like execute on that, right? WHO, good example. It's a UN organization. Donald Trump's like, screw you, we're not going to finance you anymore. And that's a retraction of multilateral funding that they used to give, and they'll just say, no, we're not going to give you it anymore. So that's how it works. Yeah. But it's interesting, though. What's interesting about once you see how all this stuff works, you can see, well, okay, well, do certain states have more influence than others based on the amount of money they give? Of course they do. Yes, of course they do. So, it's not like it's kind of like, oh, everything's clean. There's a lot of like kind of influencing that goes on. So if there's some accusations about China having undue influence in the WHO, I don't know for sure. I don't work at the WHO, but it's possible, right? Same thing would be for the Biodiversity Convention. It's possible. And then there's the North-South issues, and then this is when in climate change and other agendas you have countries that don't have financing, but they aren't expected to be donors. Like developed countries are donors, and then developing countries are recipients. So land Costa Rica, which is in this weird in-between place, which they were a developing country at one point in time, whereas now they're there's a second world or developed-ish country. So they're not a recipient. Like you don't go do these projects in Costa Rica. They're a third world country. We don't even use those words anymore, I guess. It's kind of politically incorrect. I don't know. But they, there's not a lot of like projects that are funded by the World Bank and the GEF and so forth. Well, World Bank maybe, but like, UN development program things there. Whereas if you go to Honduras, way more. If you go to, say, St. Lucia, more. You go those countries. So maybe there are, I don't know, but last time I checked, Costa Rica wasn't one of the ones, and certainly in Central America. Guatemala, way more. Nicaragua, yes. El Salvador, yes. Honduras, yes. Panama, no. Costa Rica, no. So there we go. That is the talk for this evening. Sustainable Development Goals. Hopefully you've learned a bit more about them. You've got some resources. That sheet's going to be shared, so you can go and check that out when you get a chance, if you want. And we will get more into this for those that are in the accounting. When we get into the accounting part, we're going to look at these reports, the environmental, social, and governance reports. You're going to go buy yourself a go do it. I don't mean to be a smartass about it, but I just see it, and it's like, I see it. It happens all the time. I go to a conference and they're wearing a pin, and I wear like an Ozzy Osbourne pin or something like that, and they go, "What are you doing?" You know what I mean? Like, I just like to have fun with it. Yeah, that's how it works, generally speaking. But the reports are great. If you want to look at the VNRs, that gives you a really good idea of what's going on. At least you know where to look, right? You want to know what's going on in Brunei or Mali or Ghana or Saudi or wherever, you go to that report and say, okay, cool. Pins on the back are great. Okay, I've created a monster here. I'm going to have like a horde of people wearing SDG pins. That's all right, though. I guess it's good. You can get t-shirts, too, if you want. I guess I see you next week. A new program. How's that? I guess I see you next week in a new program. Yeah, this is open, right? So this forum is like, we're gonna keep on going with all this stuff. So it's open. I'll open this up a bit more. So hopefully we don't get any like hackers come in and take control. Oh, ENVP 322. Cool. Okay, that's gonna be a good course. That's like, is this indefinite? What do you mean? This program? Podcasts. Yeah, I'll go until I need a break. Yeah, I do. I mean, I do it every week now, and I do it when I'm teaching a course, and I'm always teaching a course now. So I guess I just keep on doing it. I try and make it fresh though, and link it to whatever I'm teaching roughly, like some connections, and then what's going on. And I'm always working on stuff. So I mean, I just talk about stuff we're working on, and then it should be interesting. So there we go. Yes, there's previous. This isn't the first one. There's previous ones that have been on there. You can go check them out. I haven't done audio, like I don't have them as audio downloadable ones, but in the future we'll see how it goes. This is all based on demand. So see where things go. Maybe we'll have a feature film at some point in time. You never know. You never know. So I got to check out. It's dinner time for Oswald Sr. And I'm going to close. So if you have any questions, shoot me a note. And in the meantime, keep on rocking.